So today I want to talk about the complex interaction between food intolerances, food reactions, and mold exposure. We can also correlate this a little bit with something like a candida overgrowth in the gut, but I see the most severe presentation of this kind of like cascade of food intolerances with my mold affected patients, the people who have been exposed to mold in the environment, or, even more an elephant in the room, have mold colonizing their body, their gut mainly, sometimes their lungs, things like aspergillosis, massively under-recognized. And for the people who that's their big driver, huge improvements when we actually resolve that root cause. But today, the domino effect of food intolerances. So if you first started out with something like a histamine intolerance, clogged nose, headaches, insomnia, heart palpitations, whatever it is, that kicked on down to something like an oxalate intolerance, sore joints, sore muscles, UTI-like symptoms without a urinary tract infection, and then that kicked on down to, actually now I can't tolerate sulfur foods, things like eggs, onions, garlic. They all make me bloated, they make me gassy, I've got abdominal pain, I'm either constipated or I've got diarrhea. And then finally, the last kind of domino here, which is where people have really, they've gone a long way into dysfunction, a salicylate intolerance. It's hard to pin down on the symptoms there. It's pretty kind of big picture, but a lot of kind of itchiness, sometimes red face, sometimes bloodshot eyes, sometimes a chesty cough as well. Those are all salicylate symptoms. Again, if you have wound up with a salicylate intolerance, a whole bunch has happened along your health journey to wind up somewhere where the body is reacting to things that are ubiquitous in nature. You look at a low salicylate diet, it's like most foods. Most foods contain salicylates, most herbs, people can't do herbs. So, we're going to get into that and we'll talk about it from the top all the way down. It's going to be a little bit of info heavy, but I'll try and keep it accessible and relatable and useful for you. All right, let's get into it. Now, the first domino event with mold exposure in the environment, candida in the gut, or mold growing in the gut as well, generally like a green mold, aspergillus growing in the gut. The first presenting symptom that's pretty obvious to me when I'm looking for it would be histamine intolerance. And the really kind of big piece there is a lot of what either candida produces, mold produces, those mycotoxins, they are threats to the body, and the immune system goes into a bit of like a thermal meltdown, activates these kind of mast cells, which are like these little sentinel white blood cells, and they just start spitting out histamine everywhere, trying to resolve an issue. The problem is when you can't kind of eliminate that, you can't get ahead of that, you can't get on top of that, you just wind up in this constant state of too much histamine in the system. That's the biggest driver, right? You can also have gut damage as part of this whole presenting symptom, and then you get a downregulation or a decrease or kind of damage to the DAO production kind of machinery on the, in the gut and the small bowel, and then you have trouble degrading extracellular histamine as well. So what does that mean? It means that the deeper you go into it, the more intolerant you are to histamine foods, whether that's things like aged cheese, whether that's fermented foods like sauerkraut or kimchi or kombucha, whether you're having trouble with things like dairy can be part of that piece as well. A lot of those kind of aged dairies, like we mentioned, aged cheese, a lot of fruits and vegetables, spinach is big, tomatoes are big, avocado is really big, strawberries are big, and alcohol is a really big one, whether that's fermented or whether that's your spirits, your kind of vodkas and your gins and your whiskeys. They can all be problematic for histamine intolerant patients. So that's problem number one, and that's the first kind of sign that things are going wrong for most people: mold affected, candida issues. And then the second really big piece that kind of flares after a little while would be physical pain. And a lot of that's kind of like connective tissue, whether that's like your joints, you know, even the muscles can become painful. You see a lot of that with things like post-exertional malaise. You just kind of don't go well after you kind of move or you exercise. And I'm always suspecting there, when there's evidence of fungal overgrowth or mold, I'm always suspecting that there is an oxalate issue until proven otherwise. Mold, candida, they can all produce oxalate as part of their kind of pathways. And whenever I see extremely elevated oxalates, we're talking like way into the 95th percentile, sometimes double, you know, sometimes triple, 1.5, 2 times the upper limit, 95th percentile. That's where I'm starting to suspect mold exposure or a pretty entrenched kind of fungal candida issue in the gut. And the big symptoms there would be pain. So that is the next kind of domino down. That's the next kind of sequence of events for most people. And then the consequence of elevated oxalates, and this is all part of like a journey. There's like a timeline here as well. And the consequence of elevated oxalates is that you start depleting your sulfur. It's just the weirdest thing in the world. When you have elevated oxalates, you exchange that for sulfate and you actually pee out sulfate and actually bring the oxalates back into the body. And it's just the weirdest little thing in the world, but it's through the SAT1 transporter, and it's a 1-for-1 exchange. So you wind up low on sulfur, and then your sulfur metabolism pathways can get a little bit messed up. I've been covering a lot on hydrogen sulfide lately. I see it a lot, and I'm always questioning, was oxalates the root cause driver? Was that the upstream issue for your hydrogen sulfide? And is that a fungal mold issue? Oxalates can also be fat malabsorption. You can have issues with your microbiome, kind of deficiencies in those bugs that break down oxalates. But the fungal mold piece is just the biggest elephant in the room when we're talking about excessive oxalates in a big and meaningful way, for sure. So those are the two big ones: oxalates down to sulfur, and the big symptoms of sulfur intolerance would be bloating, distension, gas, abdominal pain, issues with fattier foods, 'cause sometimes that'll feed that sulfur reducing bacteria, and it blooms when you get your kind of bile flowing. So if you have like fat intolerances and a lot of gut issues, you might question whether that's a downstream issue from oxalates to sulfur. And then the last big piece there, which we mentioned right up top, is a salicylate intolerance. And this again is the kind of downstream from something like low sulfur. And the connection that I've made there, obviously it's not, you know, every person with a salicylate intolerance is sulfur deficient, but if it goes high oxalates, low sulfur, and then low sulfur, you're lacking the machinery to power the enzymes, sulfate, power the sulfur transferase enzymes that degrade salicylates. It's a phenyl sulfur transferase. It's a sulfotransferase enzyme that helps break down something that is just ubiquitous in nature. It's kind of everywhere, and it's in most plants and definitely in most herbs as well. You know, it's full of, you know, in olive oil and capsicums, and you know, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So when someone comes to me and either they have evidence of or they suspect that they're salicylate intolerant, most people know, right? They've been unwell for long enough, and they've got like a sheet of things that they can and can't have, and there's a little pattern there, again, whether they know it or not, that salicylates are an issue. There's been a whole journey and a domino down to that issue, and repleting sulfur, which can be tricky because people with sulfur deficiencies tend to be sulfur intolerant, so that's a whole kind of minefield that you have to navigate. But repleting sulfur to fuel the enzymes to break down salicylates is a big piece around getting them better. And that all can come back to a fungal or mold issue right up top. So from the mold fungal, the histamine intolerance is the first kind of domino. Second big one that's not connected to histamine would be oxalates, and then oxalates is a big domino down to salicylate intolerance. I'm not saying that everyone with mold exposure or candida has these symptoms. I'm just saying that when I see someone who is deep in oxalate overload and they've got arthritis and they're 30 years old, or they're exercise intolerant, and we test them and their oxalates are through the roof, they're salicylate intolerant and they're all itchy and they're face flushing and bloodshot eyes and just can't tolerate any food, I'm starting to suspect that a fungal overgrowth or mold exposure in the environment is part of that journey. And then we talk about it. What was your experience with antibiotics growing up? When did things go wrong? Where were you living? Oh, actually, we had a leak in the roof and mold that, just got painted over, or there's just so many horror stories. Often showers leak into bedrooms and people don't know about it, or they just kind of neglect it because they don't think it's an issue. It's a really, really big issue for a lot of people. And if you're someone that kind of relates to this domino of food intolerances, then it's worth looking into for sure. First place I start there, particularly when it's like chronic symptoms, when it's significant symptoms, I'll start with an organic acids test, and that will tell me most of what's going on. I have been seeing a few mold patients where their O tests look fine, and then we test for mycotoxins and it's a significant issue. But often, and I'm saying maybe like 85% of the time, the organic acids test is going to tell us enough of what we need to know to assess properly and treat effectively. So hopefully that was helpful. If it was, like, comment, and subscribe. Really helps me grow the channel and reach more people. And if you are dealing with these food intolerances and you're looking for support, you live in Australia or New Zealand, then there will be a booking link below. I'll speak to you soon.